On behalf of the Enoch Seminar and its founding director, Gabriella Boccaccini, I welcome you to Speaking of the Pharisees, a virtual meeting with a most ambitious agenda, namely to show how contemporary research can engage popular discourse, create new paths toward interreligious relations, and correct harmful teaching and preaching. We have asked the esteemed speakers to show how their research has ongoing implications, each in 5-minute presentations. These concise presentations broach subjects more fully explored in the recent publication, The Pharisees, edited by Joseph Sievers and A.J. Levine. This comprehensive and accessible resource should be acquired by everyone. The ambitious nature of this meeting is of particular import, given that today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Our meeting seeks to contribute to the dismantling of the vilification of the Pharisees, a vilification that spread in Christian discourse from the Pharisees to all Jews, a vilification that contributed to centuries of anti-Semitism. Anyone whose scholarship, teaching, or preaching engages early Christianity must be prepared to confront audiences steeped in caricatures of the Pharisees, and then to challenge the caricatures. The first century CE Jewish historian Josephus presents the Pharisees as one of several schools of Jewish thought that interpreted Torah, that is, instructions the divine gave to Israel. Diverse Jewish communities had different interpretations. In discussing something as important as how to best follow divine instructions, disagreement sometimes led to polemics. Both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament Gospels depict some of these disagreements with Pharisees, and they do so in the context of polemic. Thus, as several of our presenters demonstrate, our knowledge of the Pharisees is often based not on objective descriptions, but on polemical context. Not all New Testament commentary regarding the Pharisees is negative. Paul, the only Pharisee from whom we have written records, celebrates his Pharisaic identity. Nicodemus from John's Gospel and Gamaliel from the book of Acts, both explicitly named Pharisees, can be viewed as fully positive figures. Indeed, even later Christian theologians like Calvin had positive comments to make about the Pharisees, and the depiction of the Pharisees in art, especially of the Pharisees Nicodemus and Paul, is generally positive. But despite these positive depictions, the reception of select gospel traditions concerning the Pharisees have prevailed in Christian imagination. Especially potent is the representation of the Pharisees in Matthew 23. There, Jesus issues invectives against the Pharisees. They are legalistic hypocrites, blind guides, whitewashed tombs, a brood of vipers. Luke's Jesus charges the Pharisees with being elitist lovers of money. In today's popular discourse, books and sermons with titles, "You might be a Pharisee if," these are designed to show Christians what they should not be. People continue to insult each other by calling them modern day Pharisees, even though they have no clue who ancient Pharisees were. Conversely, in broader Jewish imagination, the Pharisees are preservers of Jewish identity, the egalitarian interpreters of Torah, the popular teachers of their time who helped fellow Jews sanctify daily life. Ironically, as the essays in the Pharisees demonstrate repeatedly, the Pharisees, and that is the volume, The Pharisees, demonstrate repeatedly, the Pharisees approach Torah in a way that would have been considered less conservative and more lenient than, for example, the Covenanters at Qumran. As Mary Boyce notes in Has God Only One Blessing, negative depictions in the Gospels of Pharisees have become equated in the Christian psyche with Jews and Judaism. Centuries of othering and dehumanizing rhetoric have led not only to prejudice, but also to violence by Christians against Jews. Christian misconstruals of Pharisees, and by extension of Judaism, past and present, which have contributed to a toxic anti-Semitic worldview. And so Christians have much work to do in confronting how best to interpret sacred text, not only for the sake of Jewish-Christian relations, but also so that on Holocaust Remembrance Day, we can pledge with sincerity, never again. The topic that we address today is so important that multiple professional societies are sponsoring this event, including the American Jewish Committee, the Catholic Biblical Association of America, the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations, the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, the International Council of Christians and Jews, the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies, the Pontifical Biblical Institute, the Society of Biblical Literature, and the Enoch Seminar. We're grateful to those organizations for their commitment to education and for stepping up to challenge anti-Semitism. Similarly, we look forward to you also taking what you learned from this meeting and sharing it with your communities and your students. As I conclude, I'd like to acknowledge the technological talent of Joshua Scott, the Secretary of the Enoch Seminar, who is facilitating this virtual meeting. And finally, to introduce to you our next speaker, the Executive Director of the Catholic Biblical Association, Archie Wright. Thank you.
Kelly, thank you very much. Thank you to Gabriella Boccaccini and the Enoch Seminar on behalf of the Catholic Biblical Association for the opportunity to co-sponsor this event, along with the many other great organizations for this very exciting event. We're all looking forward to it. The event is being live streamed on the Enoch Seminar webpage, and a recording will be available on the Enoch Seminar website after the event. I will be hosting and I will introduce each speaker, and it is my task to hold them to their 5-minute maximum. The chat feature will be available for everyone to post questions to presenters or to the panel in general. Joshua Scott will be monitoring the chat, and following the presentations, we shall have about a 15 to 18-minute Q&A session. If you have a question that is not asked or answered during the Q&A time, please email your question to Joshua Scott. His email is in the chat box, or will be in the chat box at one point, and he will forward your question to the presenters best able to respond to your question. And they will do their best to respond via email following the event. At the conclusion of the Q&A, Gabriella will offer a few closing remarks to the event. It's my honor to introduce our first speaker, Joseph Sievers. Joseph.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you to everyone who has made this possible. Kelly has stated what is wrong with popular notions about the Pharisees. Now, what can we do about them? We begin by asking what we really know about the Pharisees. Our volume, The Pharisees, which addresses the question from numerous angles, is based on a conference, Jesus and the Pharisees, an interdisciplinary reappraisal that was held in Rome in 2019. The conference convened a diverse group of top-notch scholars from different fields of research and different backgrounds. They come from about a dozen countries, including Argentina, Canada, the US, Israel, and several European countries. Following the conference, and so realizing areas that are also needed coverage, we invited other scholars to add new chapters. The editors are a female Jewish New Testament scholar from the United States and a male Catholic Jewish studies specialist, originally from Germany. That's myself. We worked with Eerdmans, an American publisher with a Dutch Reformed background. It was impossible to be all-inclusive, but we did manage to bring together and keep together quite a diverse lot. The volume tries systematically to address not only who the Pharisees were, but also how they have been understood across the centuries, starting with an essay by my colleague Craig Morrison on the name Pharisees. We will hear from him. After a search for the original origins of the Pharisees, brings little certainty, but makes plausible their existence since the 2nd century BCE, we systematically study all the possible sources, from archaeology to Dead Sea Scrolls, to Flavius Josephus, to Paul, the Gospels and Acts, to early rabbinic literature. We do not stop at the ancient sources, however, but look at the reception history as well. In that endeavor, we obviously had to be selective. We start off with assessments of the patristic literature and then medieval Jewish texts. Brendel Zachman, a specialist in Reformation studies, gives a nuanced overview of Martin Luther's and John Calvin's attitude towards the Pharisees. The essays discuss Pharisees not only as they are presented in theological and historical works and in controversies between Christians and Jews of the 19th and 20th century, but also in various art forms, including painting, drama, and film, and in religious textbooks. The final section of the book is devoted to proposals for today's and tomorrow's approaches to Pharisees in teaching, preaching, and daily attitudes. A.J. Levine will have more to say on this. The conference was a landmark event, a celebration of 110 years since the founding of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. A special audience with Pope Francis was one of its highlights. His prepared remarks, which are included in the volume, emphasize that I am certain these studies and the new avenues they will open will positively contribute to the relationship between Jews and Christians in view of an ever more profound and fraternal dialogue. Our volume would like to contribute to finding the elusive truth and overcome untruth about the Pharisees. It was an honor and a joy to work with 27 Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and unaffiliated contributors, and especially with my co-editor, A.J. Levine. The volume is getting a lot of attention in different quarters.
27.
Yes, so I leave them, some of it out. But this morning, I attended an event at the Lateran University in Rome on the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day. In it, a biblical scholar described what has changed in New Testament study since the Shoah. He indicated the Pharisees volume as an example. I could list other reactions, but my time is up. Thanks to Gabriele Boccaccini and the Enoch Seminar for making this event possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Our next speaker is Craig Morrison.
I want to join with Joe and others in thanking the organizers for organizing this and addressing this very timely topic. My contribution to this conversation is on the meaning of the name Pharisee. Following the insights from linguistics, the etymology of a word tells us nothing about its current meaning. This is especially true for onomastics. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, who live down the street, may not even own an oven, though their name is Baker. Because there is such a dearth of historical data about the Pharisees, appeal is often made to the etymology of the word parash, in search of something scientific to describe this group. But as linguistics reminds us, etymology studies the history of the word. It does not tell us what the word means. Still, etymological arguments appear in most Bible dictionaries, though their insights are dubious. Many Christian scholars are fairly certain that the word means separated, but separated from who or what is not contained in this etymology. then the notion separated can lead scholars to imaginative and sometimes pejorative descriptions of so-called Pharisaical separation. Jewish scholars suggest that the word means explainers or clarifiers. This too is a possible etymology and illustrates the wide diversity of etymological meanings found in the literature, none of which are of much use for arriving at the historical Pharisees. Thus, my contribution supports what Joseph Siebers has taught for years. We know less about the historical Pharisees today than we knew 50 years ago. This is an important point of departure for preaching and teaching about the Pharisees. With regard to preaching, in the Catholic tradition, the preacher only has a few minutes, 7 minutes according to Pope Francis. This is not the place to engage a study of first century Judaism or to address complex issues such as first century Jewish observances. So how should the Pharisees be presented in preaching? As a people seeking holiness, seeking to be faithful to the Torah in their daily lives. In this, Jews and Christians share the same goal. We both seek holiness, expressed by actualizing in the world the biblical message in which we believe, to mend the world, borrowing the words of Isaac Luria. Pharisees were not bad people. They were not trafficking in migrant workers or arms dealers or anything of the sort. They were people seeking holiness, to be faithful to the Torah. Preaching should begin here. It is often repeated that Judaism in the first century was not monolithic. Part of the debate among Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes concerned how to live holy, saintly lives. Each group expressed their holiness in different ways. Through the centuries, Christians of every age have sought holiness. Encratism in the 2nd century was such a movement for holiness, but today many of us would not follow its anthropology or theology on the road to holiness. The flight of the desert writers to the Wadi Kadisha in Lebanon in search of mysticism is another example. Movements in Judaism, such as the Hasidic movement that includes music and dance, is another search for holiness. The Pharisaical search for holiness is reported in the Gospels. The temptation to masterplot the Gospel should be avoided in preaching. This is the tendency to apply a masterplot of good guys and bad guys, cops and robbers, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader to the Gospels. Thus, we set up the Gospel story looking for these contrasts between Jesus and the Jews. The Christians are the good guys, the Jews and Pharisees are the bad guys, while in fact, they are all members of a community seeking holiness, seeking to be faithful to the divine word, though they disagree on the concrete details of that road to holiness.
30 seconds, Craig.
The fundamental issue for me is that our preaching and our homilies cannot engender hatred for another person or group. No one listening to my preaching should leave the church thinking less of the Jews. So within the academy, trying to understand the Pharisees through etymology of the word does not lead to any clear results and should be abandoned. And when we mention the Pharisees in preaching, the point of departure is that the Pharisees, like the Jesus followers, were all seeking holiness. We're seeking to actualize and incarnate the biblical word in their communities and in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Our next speaker is Steve Mason.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm going to share my screen here and hope this works. Fine. Can everybody see this? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So our theme is speaking of the Pharisees, both as they were in the ancient world and later. How do we talk about them now? Our task, and I want to refer to this question because that's the one I'm trying to answer, is basically this: given that the Pharisees and Pharisaic remain terms of disapprobation in public discourse and can convey anti-Semitic impressions, how do we address the Pharisees in teaching and preaching? Now, I realize that my answers to the question may be those of a lost sheep, because I'm not sure I understand all the premises behind it, but I'll do my best. My first thought is that the concern expressed here is more than understandable given the history of Jewish-Christian relations. But also for that reason, it has been a central preoccupation of scholars for about 150 years. Just a few of the experts who have called for a better accounting of the Pharisees in Jewish-Christian relations were Gretz, Schechter, Herford, Moore, Parks, and Finkelstein before the World War II and the Shoah. And since then, of course, big names include Rivkin, Neusner, Sanders, all trying to come up with a better picture of the Pharisees, also for church use. To see their concerns, look at just, for example, at Travers Herford. Look at all the works he produced on Pharisaism and the Pharisees, and look at the dates. So already back before the First World War, 1925, the truth about the Pharisees. And if you look at what he's reacting against, it's very much similar to what we're still talking about a century later. So what I want to begin with, my first thought is that this is rather sobering. We've been at this for a very long time, and that was well before the Second World War. And these were prominent, urgent talks he was giving in London and all around the UK. My second thought is, I speak to you as a historian, but it seems to me, I'm going to try this out on you, that the most promising way forward has more to do with traditions than with history. I'll try to explain. History can't, as far as I can see, declare groups good or bad. Groups look different to different observers. Think about university administrators, politicians, in the US, Democrats and Republicans, union leaders. Are they good or are they bad? Well, different observers see them differently. And we happen to know that in the case of the Pharisees, well, the Sadducees were on their case all the time. Josephus didn't care for them, for his particular views, from his perspective. Some Qumran texts, at least in their standard reading, viewed them with disapprobation as seekers after smooth things. Some early Christian followers, to judge from Mark, Matthew, and John, also held them in disdain, but not all. Luke Acts, which accounts for 25% of the New Testament by bulk, takes a rather favorable view of them on the whole. Now, should historians say those ancient impressions were all wrong, or should we rather encourage understanding of these diverse perceptions in their historical context? My third thought is, in general, methodologically, how far can, should, does history shape tradition? After all, I have heard that some historians cast doubt on the existence of Abraham, the Exodus, conquest of Canaan, the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection of Christ, Thomas' trip to India, Muhammad's night journey. All of these are basic to various traditions. Should we, as historians,
30 seconds, Steve,
be involved in trying to silence them? I'm not sure. Finally, my last question is, do people really become anti-Semitic because of a view of the historical Pharisees, and therefore will a change of that view change their minds? I don't think it works that way. So my proposals are, let's try to build respect among our communities. When hearts and minds are receptive and curious, we can compare our traditions. And once that curiosity and motivation are there, we might even bring in historical research and such a state-of-the-art book as Levine and Sievers. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Our next speaker is Hermit Lure. Hermit?
Yep. Good evening from Bonn. Thank you very much indeed for the organization and for attending this event. So here are my 3 bullet points. As I was asked by Joshua, Luke acts as a source. Luke acts as a source for the history of the Pharisees. and Luke Acts is a source of anti-Jewish stereotypes. Luke Acts is a source. Both books can and should be used as a historical source for the time they cover. They are roughly 50 years of the 1st century CE, and for the times they were composed, supposedly end of the 1st or beginning of the 2nd century CE. Both views or approaches should be balanced, as we now wouldn't take a book of history, let's say on Empress Maria Theresa, just to be informed about its author. So we shouldn't take Luke Acts only to be informed about the author of Luke Acts and his time. The books themselves intend to be a historical account. Nevertheless, it's a source of specific and mixed character. It has mythical elements, for example, the genealogy in Luke 3. It has clearly legendary elements, the infancy stories, the accounts of Paul's Christ vision, conversion, as it was formerly labeled. Both parts of the work use sources, Luke as well as Acts, and I termed in my contribution to the Levin-Sievers volume as mostly second-hand historiography. Clearly enough from the prologue, it has more than merely referential purpose. It's composed of 2 books, and that means there are different narratives focusing different events and characters. They have different sources, as signaled before. They can be applied possibly to different dates of composition, and they may imply different views and intentions. It is a narrative, and we have to account for it when we analyze it. It's no use to make some interpretive cherry picking, picking up some saying here, some scene there. There are 2 different plots in Luke focusing on Jesus, in Acts on the Jews, the Romans, and the Way, and their respective representatives. And we have to take into account position of episodes, character development within the narrative. This asks for detailed reading and very careful synoptic comparison. Sympathy or favor, disfavor are not adequate overall categories for description of this work as for any other work of historiography. We have to soberly make a distinction between the author, if there is, that's another debate, the narrators, and the main figures, heroes of the narrative. So while Luke acts as clearly sympathetic mostly of Jesus, partly of Paul, there is no identification between the narrator and these main figures, and that has to be taken into account. And the text also implies some irony, for example, in the scene in Jerusalem, scene Acts 23, 6-10. Luke Acts is clearly a source for the history of the Pharisees. It's one of our most important sources. It's especially important for Paul, who is labeled a Pharisee, never an apostle in Acts, and his possibly his teacher Gamaliel the Elder. It's post-70 CE, for example, as Mark, Matthew, John, and Flavius Josephus, and earlier rabbinic texts, if there are, but in contrast to the Dead Sea Scrolls. What can we learn? Certainly, there's the importance and influence of the Pharisaic movement in Galilee, but also in the Jerusalem Council, the Sanhedrin, in the years around 30 CE. It is clearly a reductionist view of Jewish parties, not sects, in Luke's time, to be compared with Josephus. And Acts presents the emergent Christ movement in a triangle with Judaism and the empire and the Pharisees as part of this plot of connection and conflict. And that may tell us something about the viewpoint, perhaps also the historical context of Luke Acts.
30 seconds, Herman.
Yes, Luke Acts is a source of anti-Jewish stereotypes, as the other Gospels. So it's a transference we witness a transference of anti-Pharisaic stereotypes to anti-Jewish stereotypes. Some quotation of indications of texts here, which are specific for Luke: the hypocrisies of the Pharisees' love of money, the Pharisees' self-righteousness, and the scene of Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple. So that's the takeaway. 3 bullet points. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Herman. Our next speaker is Harold Epridge.
Hey, very nice to be with you, and I'm supposed to be talking a little bit about the Gospel of John, what's in it, and what we might take away from it. The Pharisees appear 18 times in the fourth Gospel. They send priests and Levites from Jerusalem to question John the Baptist in chapter 1. In chapter 4, they seem to be concerned about Jesus' baptizing activity, which leads him to leave Judea. Jesus returns to Jerusalem at Sukkot and Hanukkah, and the Pharisees work together with the chief priests in chapters 7 and 11, half a dozen times in each. And on 2 occasions, they send soldiers to arrest Jesus, both in chapter 7 and the final time in chapter 18. In chapter 8, the Pharisees challenge Jesus' claim to be the light of the world. And later, they react to his healing of a blind man in chapter 9, showing, as the narrator indicates, their own blindness. Although in John the chief priests alone plot against Jesus in chapter 12, the Pharisees soon reappear at their side in 12:19. They are, in other words, a persistent part of the opposition to Jesus. Twice, Pharisees are associated not only with priests, but with rulers or leaders in chapters 3 and 7. Once, they are distinguished from other leaders. Only in the interpolated pericope of the adulteress in chapter 8 is there a connection between Pharisees and scribes. So, basically, the gospel is not interested in describing much about who the Pharisees were or what they believed. They do contrast themselves with common people who do not know the law in 749, but the contents of what they know is not specified. Their teachings remain obscure. There's no discussion of halakhic matters, no dining with tax collectors and sinners or fasting. Nor does the gospel mention points of contention that are noted elsewhere: exorcism, hand-washing, divorce. The one exception is Sabbath observance, which arises in connection with healings in chapters 5 and 9, defended by Jesus in a rather traditional way in chapter 7. The Pharisees are part of a larger picture of Jewish leadership opposed to Jesus, a picture that may well have developed during the history of the gospel's composition, a development evident in 1:19, in which the people who were sent from Jerusalem are the Judaioi, and then later the Pharisees. So it looks like there's another layer added to the gospel. The meshing of Pharisees and Judaioi, however we want to translate that, appears again in the highly polemical passages in chapters 7 and 8. Pharisees are prominent at the start of those chapters, but they then disappear and leave only the Judaioi at the end. And as many have noted, there's obviously a polemical program in evidence here. But in addition to this polemical program and this depiction of the Pharisees as an important part of the opposition to Jesus, there's the picture of Nicodemus, who appears in the nocturnal encounter with Jesus in chapter 2, where he seems attracted but a bit befuddled. He appears again in a meeting of the high priests and Pharisees in chapter 7, where he apparently defends Jesus up to a point. His last appearance is at the burial of Jesus, where he works with Joseph of Arimathea to care for Jesus' corpse in a rather extravagant way. The focus has generated considerable speculation about a historical reminiscence of a prominent family in Jerusalem, known from Josephus and Rabbinic sources. A gesture toward a historical figure might be possible, but that doesn't tell us how this figure is used in the narrative. Nicodemus in the fourth gospel defends strict legal principle in chapter 7. And in chapter 19, he enables that very elaborate and expensive burial for Jesus. Does all of this, especially the burial, show him to be a secret follower of Jesus? Or does the burial show him to be one of inadequate faith, focused on Jesus' death, not his resurrected life? Both readings have been offered of the story. There is, in other words, tantalizing ambiguity in the narrative. At the very least, however, the narrative shows that someone from the opposition could act in a sympathetic way to Jesus. Or, as the gospel insists, outcomes are not ultimately predetermined by origins. Being born again is a distinct possibility. So
30 seconds, Harry.
What can we infer from this? As historians, not much. As theologians, a plus and a minus. The plus is that someone from the opposition is in a positive relationship with the leader of this community. The minus is that that relationship is being judged on the evangelist's terms, and those stand in need of some criticism. That's the Jews, the Pharisees, and the Gospel of John. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Very much appreciated. Our next speaker is Mireille Hadas-Lebel.
Hello, speaking from Paris. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
As strange as he has been, I'm speaking about the rabbinic sources about the Pharisees. As strange as it may seem, Pharisees are not frequently mentioned in rabbinic literature. The rabbis who are supposed to have inherited from them are never called Pharisees, Parushim, but Chachamim or sages. Except for a few instances, the word Parush even appears in the singular and even sounds sometimes derogatory. This raises a perplexing question: to what extent are we allowed to make use of rabbinic literature in order to assess the information brought by our main sources on first century Pharisees, namely Josephus and the New Testament? The continuity between first century Pharisees and the rabbis, which has long been taken for granted, is often challenged today. Indeed, we must observe the scarcity of the sources. What are the few rabbinic sources about the Pharisees, and what can we learn from them? In order to track first century Pharisees, we should refer to the older layer of the Talmud, which may have retained some memory of them. It is very tempting to rely on the first chapter of Mishnah Avot, which seems to contain some of the most ancient sayings of the rabbis and may constitute what Jacob Neusner calls the prehistory of the Pharisaism. Still, none of the rabbinic authorities quoted in Pirkei Avot is called a Pharisee, including Gamliel and his son Simon, who are presented as such in the Acts of Josephus. If we turn to other treatises of the Mishnaic literature, the more reliable passages are those where the Pharisees are opposed to the Sadducees, reflecting debates which existed prior to the destruction of the temple. Mishnah Yadayim, chapter 4, about the Rabbi Natan, Tosefta, possibly the Talmud of Jerusalem, or only Baraita in the Babylonian Talmud, but not Babylonian Talmud itself. A few lines in Avot de Rabbi Natan confirm that not only the Sadducees did not believe in afterlife, but they mocked the Pharisees, the Pharisaic belief in it. They say the Pharisees mortify themselves in this world, but in the world to come, they will get nothing. Exactly as they mock the belief of Jesus in resurrection according to the synoptic gospels. The other differences mainly concern legal, halachic questions, among them purity of vessels. The Sadducees deride the obsession of their adversaries on those matters, and as they wanted to purify even the menorah, says the Sadducees. This is what they say. They would purify even the globe of the sun or the light of the moon. Various other debates can be inferred from Mishnah Yadayim, chapter 4, about what renders the hands unclean, or about the accountability of a master for damages done by his servant, or about the dating of documents by the name of the Roman governor. And of course, the list is not exhaustive. There were also some Pharisaic observances introduced into the temple service, and that the Sadducees were obliged to accept, like Simchat Bet HaShoeva on the Feast of Sukkot, or the incense burning in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, which confirms what Josephus tells us. about the influence of the Pharisees on the multitude and on the temple rights.
30
A
seconds,
parallel-
Mary.
A parallel can be drawn between those rabbinic debates and the discussions of Jesus with the Pharisees he encounters. So the polemic tone of Matthew 23, with its succession of rules, gives the impression that Pharisees are cursed by Jesus, but who, corresponding to Hebrew hoi, must not be viewed as a curse, but as a complaint. Mishnah Yadayim offers an exclamation parallel to the view of Matthew, beginning with Anu Kovlim, we complain about you, Pharisees. A last note about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees as it appears in Matthew 23. The often quoted passage in the Jerusalem Talmud does not seem to be a relevant parallel. It satirizes the behavior of some individuals who separate from the parash themselves from the community for egoistic reasons, as opposed to Abraham, who left his fatherland out of love for God. Their parush is used in the singular and does not apply to a whole group united by creeds and practices like the Pharisees. Pharisees, like Sadducees, would agree with Jesus on the principle of full respect for the word of God, the Torah, only interpretations are different. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. Our next speaker is Susanna Heschel. Susanna?
Thank you. And thank you, Joseph Sievers and Angel Levine, for inviting me to contribute. My contribution has to do with the modern scholarship on the Pharisees. The Pharisees, as we know, are considered or confused sometimes as representatives of Jews in Judaism. And for that reason, some of the popular images become of concern. This is a picture of a cup from Germany that has Pharisaea written on it, because there is, I discovered, a drink in some of the elegant cafes of Germany that's called a Pharisee. It's the drink of a hypocrite because it looks like coffee, but it actually has rum in it. So you can sit in the mornings, have your alcohol, and people walking by won't know that you're drinking alcohol, the drink of a hypocrite. Now, the discussion of Pharisees becomes important and interesting, beginning with the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the 19th century, 20th century effort to write a history of Judaism. It's interesting to me that the Pharisees as such are not discussed in the earliest decades of the quest for the historical Jesus. The discussion of the Pharisees becomes more important in Germany than anywhere else, although there are discussions in other countries in Europe and then in the United States when the especially German Jews come over. It begins with Isaac Jost, who wrote a narrative of Jewish history, several narratives actually, in which he depicts the Pharisees. He calls them hypocrites, people engaged in pilpulistic interpretation of scripture. But the breakthrough comes in 1857 with the work of Abraham Geiger, a massive book in German in which he reconstructs Second Temple Judaism's history. It's a period that has since then been unfortunately neglected, and I'll just point to Annette Yoshiko Reed as someone who is trying to revive attention to the Second Temple period. Geiger's work was important and a breakthrough, in part because it was so widely read and discussed by Christian as well as Jewish scholars, because he presented new sources and new ways of reading them. He makes use of the Mishnah and argues that, in fact, the Sadducees had their own halakha, their own oral tradition. Josephus was wrong, and he identifies elements within the Mishnah as representing Sadducean halakha. He points to differences between Pharisees and Sadducees as essential to the construction of Judaism in the Second Temple period, and he characterizes it as the Pharisees as the liberals, the Sadducees as conservative, aristocratic. Jesus was a Pharisee, he says, liberal, democratic, progressive, like the Pharisees. After 70, in the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees could no longer be priests, and so they joined the early Christian movement, Geiger argues, and that's why we have passages such as Matthew 23, because they brought their old animosity toward the Pharisees into early Christianity. But what's implied here also is that the faith of Jesus is Pharisaic Judaism, liberal, progressive. And He also argues, as someone who was engaged in the liberalization of Judaism, what came to be known as Reform Judaism, he argues that actually Reform Judaism is heir to the earliest strand of Rabbinic Judaism itself. The Christian responses to Geiger were heated, passionate. I've discussed that in my book about Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus. I also want to say, though, that the debates over the Pharisees extending into the 20th century tend to be repetitive. There's a kind of hermeneutic that sets up a seesaw. The Pharisees are bad in contrast to Jesus and the religion he introduced, rather than saying that Jesus is, in fact, one of them. Wellhausen's critique of Geiger, which was published in 1874, argues that Geiger's use of the Mishnah is unreliable because the Mishnah was codified in the mid-3rd century CE. But Wellhausen does accept the gospel sources as reliable depictions of the Pharisees. His point is simply a repetition of Emil Schur and so forth, that Judaism is legalism, stultifying, and so forth. In other words, the scholarship did not break through the kind of hermeneutic of a seesaw, the negation of the Pharisees. In the 20th century, Rudolf Bultmann still talks about the Pharisees as petty and absurd. Louis Finkelstein's approach to the Pharisees is a sociological approach that essentially repeats Geiger's argument but uses urban-rural language. Neusner's argument about the Pharisees being concerned about purity laws is important, but the Christian use of Neusner too often devolves into simply speaking of purity laws as if they're about morality. And of course, E.P. Sanders has argued that Neusner's sources are unreliable. Ultimately, I would agree with those who have already spoken that this is not really a Jewish issue as much as a Christian issue, that it's very important for us not to fetishize the Pharisees, and at the same time that building trust between Jews and Christians is ultimately going to be the basis for the kind of scholarship we want to develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Our next speaker is Adela Reinhartz.
Thank you. As Kelly and Joe have already mentioned, today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it seems like an appropriate day to hold an event like this. This is not to draw a direct line between the Christian depictions of the Pharisees and the Holocaust, but perhaps unlike Steve Mason, I actually do not doubt that the Pharisees' Christian image as arrogant, legalistic, Christ-killing hypocrites helped to lay the groundwork for modern European anti-Semitism that came to its most evil expression in the Nazi era. My brief comments focus on not on scholarly views, but on everyday views of the Pharisees and popular depictions. I'll touch briefly on 2 issues. The first concerns the disconnect between the views held by many ordinary Jews and those held by ordinary Christians. Ordinary, I mean, not scholars. For Jews, the Pharisees are the ones who saved the Jewish people from disappearing after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in the year 70. The Pharisees' flexible modes of scriptural interpretation allowed Jewish law to adapt to changing circumstances. Without the Pharisees, Jews may no longer have existed as a distinct people with our own languages, cultures, and practices. Christians have often absorbed a very different picture of the Pharisees. As we know, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus delivers a lengthy diatribe. And in the gospels as well, the Pharisees are part of a Jewish elite that bears moral responsibility for Jesus' death. From a scholarly perspective, both sets of views are naive and simplistic. But I would argue that the dangers inherent in idealizing the Pharisees are far outweighed by the dangers inherent in vilifying them. From viewing the Pharisees as hypocritical, arrogant persecutors of Christ to viewing all Jews then and now as Christ killers is but a small step. The second issue I would raise concerns the portrayal of the Pharisees in popular culture, specifically in film. I dare say that more Christians have watched films about Jesus than have read books about him. Some filmmakers recognize the dangers of portraying the Pharisees as arrogant hypocrites and either tone down their role or omit them altogether. In the post-Holocaust era, no director, aside perhaps from Mel Gibson, wants to be accused of anti-Semitism. For this reason, some either reduce the Pharisees' screen time or remove them altogether. In The Greatest Story Ever Told, for example, from 1965, there's only one single reference to the Pharisees as a group. Other films avoid the problem by presenting the Pharisees in non-human symbolic terms. Actually, it's only David Green's musical Godspell that does this. It's set in an empty New York that eerily resembles how New York actually looked in the early months of the pandemic. In this film, the Pharisees are represented by a non-human and therefore non-Jewish mechanical monster who's easily destroyed. I wish that more Jesus filmmakers would have taken such routes. Instead, we find a number of prominent Jesus movies that not only include, but also accentuate Matthew's portrayal of the Pharisees as hypocrites. Among them are D.W. Griffith's landmark silent movie, Intolerance. Released in 1916, this movie introduces the Pharisees as, quote, certain hypocrites among the Pharisees, and includes an explanatory footnote saying Pharisees, a learned Jewish party, the name possibly brought into disrepute later by hypocrites among them. This attempt to soften the portrayal is undermined by Griffith's later images and intertitles, in which the Pharisees are shown as parading their piety around the marketplace and thanking God for making them better than everybody else. Another problematic film is the highly acclaimed film by Pier Paolo Pasolini called The Gospel According to St. Matthew. This film is unique among the Jesus movies in presenting the entire text of Jesus' diatribe in Matthew 23. Pasolini's Jesus begins quietly, but by the end of the scene, he is spitting out the words at the top of his lungs. I truly wish that filmmakers would either leave the Pharisees and Jewish leaders out of it, or just stop making Jesus movies altogether. But I fear that market forces will ensure an ongoing trickle of such films. No doubt the narrative need for a dastardly villain will lead at least some of these films to perpetuate anti-Jewish views of the Pharisees as hypocritical Christ killers.
30 seconds.
It is sad but true that many viewers simply accept these films uncritically as historical, rather than as fictionalized retellings based only loosely on the Gospels, which in themselves should not be read as straightforward factual accounts of Jesus' life. I do not have an easy fix for either of these issues. Jews and Christians will likely continue to view the Pharisees in diametrically opposed ways, and filmmakers will continue to dramatize them as Jesus' opponents. I can only hope that this excellent collection of essays will be read by many, including those who teach, preach, and make movies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dal. Our next speaker is Scott McKnight.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank, with everyone else, the fine organization that this has been. I have the unenviable task of trying to represent evangelicalism, which is quite diverse, and I'm not sure I always represent it very well. But I think the American evangelicals, like Pharisees of the first century, are Bible-based people. And in American evangelicalism, Scripture is understood as inspired as a word of God and is therefore a religious text. And therefore, the judgment of Jesus on the Pharisees, say in Matthew 23, which is vituperative rhetoric, has passed on into evangelicalism as the way to talk about your enemies and to turn everybody that you don't like into a Pharisee. And as a result, great damage and wounding has been done. That evangelical viewpoint is an inheritance, as Susanna Heschel has said in all of her research and some great works. It is passed on from late 19th century German scholarship, which I experienced as a seminary student in Joachim Jeremias, in his Jerusalem book, and in the Kittel dictionaries published by Erdman's. And I purchased Strzok and Billerbeck as a seminary student and began to read it there. And there I encountered things that I am grateful to E.P. Sanders for pointing out and blasting away at. And so evangelicalism, however, I would want to emphasize, has not been able to shed its stereotypical view of Pharisees, in spite of the attempt to by some to try to correct it. I sit in churches and I listen to my students who use the word Pharisee in what they think is just a nice way to talk about your enemies. And it is a profound stereotype that is in need of correction. So I'm grateful for all the people here who have been talking about the stereotype of Pharisees, but I am ashamed in some ways for how it has infiltrated its way into evangelicalism and is still very much a common word used for opponents. I'm translating the New Testament, and I have it all done. And one of my challenges is how to translate the word Pharisee. I feel like the word Pharisee itself is a problem just as an English word because it represents so much. You look up an English dictionary and it means hypocrite. And I don't want to use that. So I am playing with the idea. I should say I'm doing more than playing with it right now. It's in my translation that I use the word observant, hoping that I can create a different impression of this group of people that Jesus engages as a part of his Jewish world. So I'm using the word observant because I think that, and a lot of the essays in this volume, which I think is a profound volume, have emphasized that they are a halakhic movement that is observant of interpretations. And I think it's fun to say that Pharisees are progressive, because in my world, when I say that, people look at me like I am a total weirdo. Like, do you not know what this word means? So for them, it's an irredeemable group of fundamentalists. And I think that that's a serious mistake. So I'm playing with that word. The other side of this for me is the classroom experience. And I have spent a lot of my time correcting my students and writing letters to pastors after sermons and going up to fellow people who preach in churches and say that's not the right way to use this term.
30 seconds.
So I have 3 prohibitions in my class. Is that students, I point out in class, I will correct them if they use Pharisee as a slur. I do not let them connect the word legalist to the word Pharisee. And I do not let them say that Jews are legalistic Pharisees and therefore equating Jews with the word Pharisee. But I want to ask forgiveness from all those who care about this for the way evangelicals have treated Pharisees and how they continue to use this term as a slur. Thank you.
Our next speaker, thank you, Scott, is Philip Cunningham.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers. It's an honor to be part of this project. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that is doing it. Can you confirm that you're seeing this?
Could you go to full screen, please? Excellent.
Yep, there you go. So my contribution to the volume was a chapter that studied what is taught about Pharisees, particularly in American Catholic textbooks from 1961 up to the present, with some reference to American Protestant textbooks that I won't get into in our limited time, but also some current Italian Catholic textbooks, thanks to Dr. Maria Bruti, who I see is among us, and I say hello. Catholic studies of textbooks use post nostra aetate Catholic, ecclesiastical, and papal speeches to record mentions of Pharisees as either accurate or inaccurate according to those Catholic documents. And then a statistical formula is used, I won't get into it, that leads to a score as to how accurate or inaccurate, how positive or negative statistically those references are. So in terms of Catholic primary textbooks in 1976, you will see that anything above the blue line in the middle are handled positively or accurately, and anything below is negative. You'll see Jesus and other Jews, the Pharisees, and the crucifixion as categories of references to Jews that scored inaccurately below zero, a negative number. The 1992 study that I did is more positive than the 76 study, which is a sign of progress, but the same troublesome topics in 76 also were in the negative zone in 1992. Here is an example of comparing the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is very influential after its release in the early 90s, to American Catholic textbooks at the time. You'll see again the same general shape of the graph. The Catechism is less positive or less accurate overall than the textbooks. But again, the important point is Jesus and other Jews, Pharisees, and the crucifixion are categories that are still remaining problematic. Let me give an example of one of dozens that I could provide in order to show kind of the problem. So this is a prayer service from a high school textbook in current use. It's a 2011, I think, publication. So this prayer begins with a comment about Jesus Christ is either God or he isn't, and everyone faces a decision. People who knew Jesus reacted to him in different ways. And then, like an antiphonal psalm at a liturgy, one side of the chapel says, the Pharisee said he drives out demons, but Peter said, the other side replies, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Side one, the Pharisees look and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. And side two, some Jewish people said, we are not stoning you for a good work, but for blasphemy, you are making yourself God. Now, of course, the problem with all of this in detail, I won't need to get into. I'll simply say, and I very much appreciate what Scott McKnight was just saying, that this establishes an oppositional identity between Jesus and his Jewish contemporaries. It reinforces it, I shouldn't say it establishes it, and that the Pharisees, of course, represent the things that Jesus was most opposed to. So here are three kinds of issues that I saw across the textbooks that others, analysts have seen. Dr. Brody saw them also, and they are found in the Catechism as well. So a first problem is that the Bible is used uncritically. Here you have a paragraph from the Catechism that talks about Jesus performing acts such as pardoning sins, showing him to be the Savior God, but certain Jews didn't recognize God made man and just saw him as a blasphemer. The problem with this is that it had, at least on one level, is that it contradicts certain statements in Catholic ecclesiastical documents, such as the notes on how to present Jews and Judaism in preaching and teaching from 1985. The Gospels are the outcome of long and complicated editorial work. You must understand the Gospels originating in three stages. The key sentence here is, certain controversies in the Gospels reflect Christian-Jewish relations long after the time of Jesus. That is hardly ever acknowledged in textbooks. Second problem or second issue that recurs is the self-understanding of Jews is not considered. Again, a catechism quote because it's convenient here. Each year, on their own admission, Jews were never able to observe the Torah, the law in its entirety without violating something. This is why every year on the Day of Atonement, the people of Israel ask God's forgiveness for their transgressions of the law because it makes up an inseparable whole. As St. James recalls, whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. Of course, this is not how Jews understand Torah observance at all. And the conciliar or the Vatican document to implement Nostra Aetate is quite clear. Christians have to strive to acquire a better knowledge of the basic components of Judaism. They must strive to learn by what essential traits Jews define themselves in the light of their own religious experience. Most textbooks don't do a very good job of this. Number three, third issue, there are gratuitous disparaging remarks that just sort of plop out of the sky. Again, an example from the Catechism. The new law is called the law of love because it makes us out of a love infused by the Spirit rather than from fear. It's a law of freedom. It sets us free from the ritual and juridical observances of the old law and makes us or prompts us to act with charity. And we pass from the condition of a servant who doesn't know what his master is doing to that of a friend of Christ, etc. Now, this is a direct contradiction of the document about implementing Nostra Aetate, which stated the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition cannot be set against the New Testament in such a way that the former seems to be a religion of only justice, fear, and legalism, with no appeal to the love of God and neighbor. Again, this is a clear as day contradiction between these two principles. So finally, some recommendations based on these various textbook studies. Critical exegetical issues cannot be avoided in textbooks. The way that the student lessons are shaped, and particularly the way that the teacher's manuals are shaped, is crucial. And as we know, many, I'm sure this is true in other churches too, but much religious education in the Catholic community happens by volunteer teachers who very likely are simply repeating things that they learned when they were children. The blasphemy charge in particular, when we're talking about the death of Jesus, needs to be unpacked for educators. Secondly, accurate historical knowledge about the Pharisees ought to be utilized in textbooks. While a lot remains unknown about them, as Craig Morrison was saying earlier, there's nonetheless data from extra-biblical sources that ought to be reckoned with. An exclusive reliance on the negative polemical passages in the Gospels will tend to produce a polemical description. Number three, we ought to get into the practice of detecting inherited, reflexive, oppositional thinking. If Jesus is set as a negative, or Jews or Pharisees or unspecified Jewish leaders are established as a negative foil for Jesus, then something is probably going to be wrong here. And I'll end with this quotation from the 1985 Vatican notes, which I think should guide all textbook writers, textbook publishers, and educators. Religious teaching, catechesis, and preaching should be a preparation not only for objectivity, justice, and tolerance, but also for understanding and dialogue. Mutual knowledge must be encouraged at every level. There is evident in particular a painful ignorance of the history and traditions of Judaism, of which only negative aspects and often caricatures seem to form part of the stock ideas of many Christians, end quote. When it comes to the Pharisees, I'm afraid that this assessment from 1985 is just as true today as it was then in teaching materials. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Our next speaker is David Rosen.
Thank you very much indeed. And I join with the others in expressing my appreciation to the organizers, and especially for the honor of being part of this particular program, as I am not an academic, but as the wonderful book itself graciously acknowledges at the beginning, I do have, if you like, some birthing privileges with regards to the conference and the publication, as it came out of an initiative when I met together with my colleague Lisa Palmieri-Billig, together with Joseph Sievers, to consult with how to address a particular problem. And I'm not going to be very diplomatic now. And the problem was not simply that there is a lack of familiarity on a broad base with the terminologies that are often abused, and once again, within the context of the way they have been popularly and are commonly understood within both the Christian Jewish community, but that this problem was, and to a large degree remains, but in particular reached to the highest levels of the Catholic Church. And specifically, there was a problem in which Pope Francis used more than half a dozen times, in fact, it might have been as much as 10 times, the terms Pharisees in a generalized, and if I may be so bold as to say, rather irresponsible manner in his homilies that were getting wide coverage. Now, and in fact, one got the impression, and I think legitimately, that the cautions of the Vatican guidelines on Nostra Aetate of 74, at least the one reference there, and then the more detailed warnings in the notes of 1985 he was not familiar with. Now, if he was familiar with, he didn't seem to have internalized them. And now the problem was not, and is not Pope Francis. I think the world knows that Pope Francis is a genuine, profound, deep friend of the Jewish people. The problem is that when this kind of generalized language and decontextualized language, language that is associated with certain stereotypes, is used even by somebody whose goodwill is absolutely not in doubt, there is the real danger that some, for example, priest in Bogota or somewhere else where there may be no Jews on the radar screen in particular, will say, hey, that's the way the Pope talks about them, why shouldn't I? And with regards not just to Pharisees, but Jews on a broad basis. And therefore, my concern was above all, not so much the academic dimension, but how we take full advantage of the academic dimension in order to address the issues of promoting mutual respect and combating prejudice. And the providence not only blessed us with this relationship with Joseph Sievers, but also the fact that it was the 110th anniversary of the Biblicum, the Jesuit connections also then with the Pope, the fact that therefore there was likely to be a papal address at an audience for the gathering of this particular conference, which of course was really a wonderful event. The paper's absolutely superb. This publication that's come out of it is absolutely excellent, and I think makes an enormous contribution. Now, there is this wonderful text which is included in the book that was the official text of Pope Francis, which he did not read. He did not read it out. He did not even refer to it. It wasn't even clear whether he'd read it, but what seems to have been clear, that whether he'd read it before or after, he had read it, because we could see that this kind of language in terms of his homilies is no longer being used. We can have no guarantee that it might not creep in again, but that's, I think, a remarkable achievement. And I think in that respect, we can say that the original purpose of this conference was a success. And what it really highlights is how important it is for academia and advocacy, ethical advocacy, I would say, to collaborate and cooperate in both combating negative prejudice, misunderstanding, and in promoting illumination, understanding, and hopefully promoting the well-being of society at large.
30 seconds.
I think that it also highlights how much we who labor in this vineyard, whether in the academic field or in the advocacy field, must not rest on our laurels. The task maybe is not Sisyphean, but it is a challenge that demands of us constant engagement and to ensure that we do not take our achievements of the past for granted in the present or the future. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our final speaker is AJ Levine. AJ?
Thank you very much. I shall attempt to share screen. And here we go. Use slideshow. So we've been talking about the Pope's address, and here's what the Pope said. And even though he did not read the text, this is the gathering that you can see here. There's Adele on the left. This is on the Vatican website, where the Pope notes that in various languages, the word Pharisee means self-righteous or hypocritical, but also, as we've heard from a number of our speakers, for many Jews, the Pharisees are the founders of Rabbinic Judaism, and hence our spiritual forebears. So stop using Pharisees, especially in a negative light. I think that's fabulous. So what are the stereotypes to avoid? Legalistic, elite, money-loving, xenophobic, misogynistic, hypocrites resistant to innovation. And if somebody says, but some of them were nice, that is insufficient. So let's try to undermine some of these stereotypes. Also to watch out for excuses, because much like Scott, and thank you, Scott, so much for speaking out when you hear negative preaching, the responses that I typically get are, well, I didn't mean to be offensive. Well, I mean, of course you didn't, but you were. Or I'm just saying what the Bible says. And here's where historical information is very important to locate, as we've heard, the polemical context in which some of these passages developed. Or some of my best friends are Jews, which is not terribly helpful if you're going to say nasty things, or just some first century Jews. I've also been told, oh, AJ, you're being too sensitive. But people would not say that if they heard other groups being disparaged. I've also heard the tu quoque argument. Jews say nasty things about Jesus in the Talmud. But what's written in the Talmud is not equivalent to what's preached to the congregation on Sunday morning. And then appeal to some of the other writings. So sometimes we have official statements that unfortunately perpetuate the stereotypes rather than correct them. And finally, increasingly, when I call out anti-Pharisaism, which typically bleeds into anti-Judaism, I get comments like there are other things that are more important. They're all important, and questions of intersectionality should have told us that. We can also look for potential model Pharisees, and this is my opportunity to say thank you to my co-editor, Joseph Sievers, who did most of the heavy lifting for this. Gamaliel, Nicodemus, as we've heard, and in Joseph Sievers' own work, as he mentions, not one of the dozen or so named Pharisees in the ancient text fits any of these negative stereotypes. So here are the contemporary popular readings. You might be a Pharisee if, where Pharisees represent whatever population the homilist sees to be judgmental, parochial, bigoted, stick in the mud, or otherwise not so nice. In other words, I would not date them. So how do we get around this? Well, here are the chapters to the book, and I'm not going to read them all out, but you should look at the book on Amazon. You should buy the book. You should read the book to show how just complicated it is to try to figure out who the Pharisees are. But perhaps we could think of this in another way. You might be a Pharisee if you believe in a combination of fate and free will. You might be a Pharisee if you believe in the resurrection of the dead and a final judgment. You might be a Pharisee if you reject elitism and favor voluntary groups over inherited positions. You might be a Pharisee if you value your traditions, but you also realize that they must be reinterpreted under new social circumstances. You might be a Pharisee if you want to make it easier and more meaningful for people to engage their traditions, and you're actually willing to discuss how to do this. You might be a Pharisee if you care about multiculturalism and maintaining group identity despite assimilationist pressures. You might be a Pharisee if you've been maligned over the centuries for your commitment to your own tradition. And if we can believe the Gospel of Luke, you might be a Pharisee if you'd have dinner with Jesus. I grant that we might want to change the word entirely, but I'm not quite there yet. What I'd like to do is change the interpretation of this term to bring Christian interpretation more in line here with Jewish interpretation, and at the very least, granted that we don't know exactly what the history is, but we can reconstruct a great deal of it. And here that you might be a Pharisee if is one of those examples. When we think about Phariseeism, we can think of them with a sense of generosity rather than a sense of approbation. We can think of them as a sense of the connections to Jews in a positive way, and therefore use both the term Pharisee and the term Jew to represent something that's honorable and to be respected. Much like
20 seconds.
Much like testimonial dinners, everything that needs to be said has already been said, but not everybody has said it. The time, however, has come to hear what you need to say. So thank you once again to all of the sponsors, especially here to Joshua and to Gabrielle, and to those of you who have tuned in.
Thank you, AJ. We now have some time for questions. We ran over about 10 minutes of our scheduled speaker time, but we have a good list of questions here. So we're going to get right to them. Timothy Yan asked the first question, and it's directed to Hermit. Why is sex not a preferred term? Hermit?
Yeah, thank you. I saw this. Well, there might be a difference in connotations between German language and English language very well. So in German, Sekte would be somewhat more pejorative than neuter, meaning being a small group secluded from the rest of the society with strict rules, etc. pp. And that's not what the Greek term hieresis, used both in Luke and Josephus, wants to convey. It just means faction, group, or whatever, and that touches upon the larger question, broader question, whether we have one common Judaism and separate from it, to be distinguished from a very specific group, or whether we have specific movements, convictions, and so in first century Judaism.
Thank you, Helmut. Kind of following along that line, this is directed to Harry from Zoni Zavit. Hypocrites means one thing in English. What does the underlying Greek word mean in its literary and historical linguistic context? Harry?
Hypocrite. Well, it means someone who's acting a part, I suppose. But I'm not sure why the question is directed to me. Maybe I'm a good example of being a hypocrite. But
it was brought up during your talk, so I think that's probably why.
Really? Okay. It's not something that appears prominently in the Gospel of John, but yeah, it means someone who's acting a part, someone who is putting on a facade and not being true to one's convictions.
Okay, thank you. From Michael Weiss, from the later perspective of the Gemara, the most significant point of contention between the Pharisees and the Sadducees seems to be the former's belief in Torah she'ba'al peh, the oral law, and the latter's rejection of it. But this is never mentioned explicitly or even alluded to. And this is, again, going to Harold, I believe. In either of the Gospels or in Josephus, what if anything is known about the historical Pharisees' belief system regarding the oral law?
I think this came up in one of the Q questions on the chat. That is that it's prominent in rabbinic sources that the Torah she'ba'al peh is characteristic of the Pharisees. And that's kind of reflected, but not in quite as explicit a form, in some of the characterizations that we get in Josephus. It's not so much there in a prominent way in the characterization, certainly not in the Gospel of John. We just don't, the Gospel of John doesn't tell us that much about the Pharisees, just that they were dedicated to the law. It's there to some extent in Matthew, I suppose. What characterizes the Pharisees in the classical description of Josephus is the things that were there, some of those things that were there on AJ's list. Belief in the resurrection, the combination of fate and free will, and that kind of thing. Not the sort of categories that are used in rabbinic sources for distinguishing Pharisees and Sadducees. So you could characterize this group in all sorts of different ways, depending on what your interests are. And that's also true for contemporary historians, isn't it?
May I jump in as well?
Please, Susanna.
So one of the arguments that Geiger makes is that the early Tannaitic literature does include by name differences of opinion regarding halachic Jewish observance between Sadducees and Pharisees. So he says that there is, therefore, he identifies a Sadducean halacha, and in some places Geiger argues, that the Pharisees are making an argument contra the Sadducees, so there's an implicit Sadducean halacha. Here he, of course, rejects Josephus, and I might add to that E.P. Sanders makes the argument that whenever someone is engaged in religious observance, including priests in the temple, they're going to think about what the Bible commands, let's say, and how it should be implemented. And that question regarding implementation would have affected the priests, the Sadducees, and therefore that is what would be a halacha, an oral law, that they would be following, their interpretation as well. So I think it's pretty clear that in that point, and not to say that Josephus is maybe misleading, let's say.
Thank you, Susanna. This question is kind of open to anyone on the panel who wishes to jump in. It's from, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Belarmi Melosi. Question is, when the Gospels use the term Pharisees and Jewish leaders, are they referring to the same group of people or not?
Different Gospels, I think, have different visions of what the Jewish leadership was, but there are distinctions between priests and Pharisees. There's some overlap, perhaps, but they're distinct. And scribes and Pharisees seem to coalesce in some of the descriptions, but they're distinct subgroups. And then you have Herodians who play a role in running things too, and they're not necessarily part of any of those groups. So leaders is a much broader category.
I'm going to jump in here too, if I can.
Yes.
What we see, and one of the essays on the Gospel of Matthew suggests this, that we begin to see a coalescing of all the different groups, so that Matthew actually brings together Pharisees and Sadducees. Mark does not do that. And at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, there's a general category of hoi Judai, or the Jews. And one can read the Gospel of John as to take the Pharisees, again, scribes don't show up except in that strange passage in chapter 8, to take the various Jewish groups and at the end see them all kind of coalescing into Jews. So John will start off talking about the Pharisees, but by the end of the chapter, they've simply become all Jews. So it depends upon what verse you read and whether you want to read the Gospel as a unified literary whole or whether you want to take out chapter by chapter.
Thank you, AJ. Philip?
Philip, can you unmute, please?
Sorry, I should know by now. Just a quick sidebar comment. The phrase "the Jewish leaders" frequently pops up both in preaching and in educational materials. But I'd like to stress that these materials hardly ever mention any of the other Jewish leaders who are actually friendly toward Jesus or have similar opinions, so that using the phrase "the Jewish leaders" actually doesn't get us away from the oppositional imagination between Jesus or Christianity and Judaism. It only sort of reinforces the idea that there's opposition if you only have Jewish leaders who are negative or against Jesus in some way.
Thank you, Philip. Hermit, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just shortly, while looking up the phrase, the tradition of the elders in the gospel, which is not the same as oral Torah, I found in Mark 7:3, the phrase "the Pharisees and all Jews," so that maybe is some beginning of the history of identification. But well, one have to view the different passages and different gospel narratives.
Thank you. Anyone else on this question? Okay, we have time for, I think, just Steve. Does Steve have
Yeah, may I jump in quickly just to say that it's not a linear thing. Luke Acts is probably, in my view, the latest of the bunch. And Luke Acts makes a rigid distinction between the Pharisees who live in the world of Jesus and then leave him. They advise him to get away from Herod Antipas, who's trying to kill him. They have him repeatedly to dinner. And then in Acts, all kinds of Christians come from the Pharisees. Gamaliel, only one sort of reference point. But in Luke Acts, the Sadducees and the temple authorities are rigidly distinguished as the ones who are really brutal towards the early Christians and so on. So there's not a linear movement towards identifying all these groups.
Thank you, Steve. Anyone else? Okay, I think we have time for maybe two more questions. So where was that one? Joe Brunt asks, the disciples and others in the Gospels sometimes called Jesus Rabbi. Would anyone, perhaps a scribe or Sadducee, have ever called Jesus a Pharisee? Anyone, it's open to anyone.
A note on rabbi, at least in the Gospel of John, it's twice translated for us as teacher. So presumably that's something of what the term meant in the first century, and anybody could have a teacher. It's not necessarily a rabbi from the Pharisaic sect. And no one calls Jesus a Pharisee as far as I know.
Thanks, Harry. Anyone else? Okay, this question is directed to AJ specifically. Are there any recommendations for accessible resources to pass along to lay people or pastors on this very important topic?
Oh, wouldn't it be nice if there were a popular version of the Pharisees collection designed for lay people, like a 6-week adult ed study program? The most helpful resource, one volume, would be the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Adele's article on the Gospel of John has already been flagged in the chat on that, which has 2 essays concerning who the Pharisees are. But the easiest thing to do, because as we've already heard, and Steve Mason was eloquent on this, I mean, we really don't know all that much. The easiest thing to do, I think, at least in teaching and preaching, is to begin with the present, recognize that Jews and Pharisees have become interchangeable in the cultural imaginations of both Jews and Christians, and then stop using the term Pharisees in a negative way. Beyond that, there are a number of brief articles about the Pharisees volume that either are out or are coming out, including an Ancient Jew review that may be helpful as well.
Thank you, AJ. We do have many more excellent questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. I really want to thank all the speakers and their presentations. Very much appreciated your comments. And I'm now going to invite Gabriela to come and offer some closing comments to our event today. Gabriela?
Thank you. We are just at the conclusion of our meeting. So for me, it's only to say a few words. I would like to thank the contribution of all organizations that have joined this meeting. As Enoch Seminar, we are especially proud to have hosted this event. We thank all the speakers that have contributed to make Speaking the Pharisees a truly global event that I hope will be long remembered. We had a lot of people join this meeting, so hundreds of people have attended this meeting on Zoom or on Facebook. And I would like also to thank all people that have joined and contributed with their comments on the chat. And a special thank at the end for Joseph Sieverts and AJ Levine for promoting the 2019 conference in Rome, editing this wonderful publication, and also offering us the opportunity for this wonderful meeting. Echoing what AJ was saying, I don't think that is too much to ask at least to Christian preachers to avoid prejudice or to be aware of prejudice and stereotypes. But by the way, have no foundations in scriptures, in Christian scriptures, where the Pharisees are not always and not only portrayed as enemies. I mean, sometimes many Christians are surprised to discover that in the scripture themselves, there are some positive passages about the Pharisees. So our goal is not to censor scripture. I mean, our goal is to provide a context in order to better understand scripture and to present all the many different ways in which the Pharisees are presented, not only in the New Testament, but also in ancient Jewish sources. We want only to go even further. The Pharisees need to be rediscovered for what they were, a dynamic and creative group that reshaped the parental traditions of Judaism along with the early Jesus movement. A sibling, a strong competitor, perhaps, not an enemy. And finally, I think that as scholars, we have a special responsibility to debunk prejudice anytime the past is maliciously used to foster intolerance and hatred. As Stephen Mason and Susanna Eschel and others have reminded us, as scholars, we also share some guilt, because it was not only preachers, but also scholars who characterized the Pharisees as agents of hypocrisy and legalism, thus reinforcing popular prejudice and anti-Semitism. The message that has come out from this meeting is strong and loud. This cycle of intolerance must stop once and for all. There are no more excuses, I think, after this meeting. It is now our responsibility, the responsibility of each of us, to carry the torch and fight the good fight. Thank you so much. Thank you for all speakers and all the audience.